Cool. All right. So the bigger one that you guys have, the bigger chunk of clay, is going to be the main vessel part of this thing, and the smaller chunk is going to be the lid. And the way that I'm kind of showing you guys to do this is like the most logical way. Like it's the simplest way of creating a jar, and all your stuff has to be consistent when you're throwing. You have to be able to center. It's easier to work with your center. If you could throw up a reasonably thin wall, it's always better. The less trimming that you have to do, the better timing is always going to be. And then I'm going to show you guys how to make the little lid, but we have to be able to use the Lid Master or any caliper tool that's going to basically show us the inside diameters of this thing. So we go like that, and then that is going to ultimately end up being the same width as those guys right there. And that's how that thing kind of works. So it's kind of a neat tool. And so again, we start off with a nicely centered thing. Nothing changes about the beginning stages of this. We open up our centers. We almost always want to check thickness for these things so that we have consistent bottoms. And I'm leaving mine a little thick because I'm going to trim split into this one. We open up our centers. And again, nothing about this part changes. Fundamentals are important. A well-centered piece is going to be a nicer piece, and it's going to be easier to work with. Now again, these things are going to shrink, so as I'm building this thing, it's going to look kind of ginormous. I'm building it with the idea that it is going to get smaller. Compress the bottoms. We are having a little bit of an issue with people's bottoms cracking, getting those S cracks. So let's make sure we get a nice compressed base. And if you want to help, if we compress out to in, and then if we compress in to out a couple of different times, using our fingers to create compression, that helps. It's not just the in to out, it's not just the out to in, it's both of them in combination. Now when we're pulling up our jars, whatever these vessels are going to end up being, doesn't really matter too much. There's one consideration that needs to be made for the vessel of this thing, for the main part of the jar. And at the very top of this thing, it is acceptable to leave a thick piece. And that piece is going to end up being the little shoulder that the lid's going to rest on. So again, the jar and pulling up the vessel is not anything magnificent. It is very consistent with everything that we have been doing. And just like we've kind of talked about before, we want to do as much work beforehand as possible so that we don't have to mess with things after they've kind of started to set up. All right, so I'm gonna define my outer edges right now. I'm gonna define my exterior shape right now, and then I'm going to leave it, finish up my rim, and then I don't have to think about anything after that. I can just let it dry and I can build my lid without having to mess with too much else. And I probably will end up trimming this a little bit to clean up this outer line. And we're good to go. All right. So the vessel is more or less done outside. And now we just want to tighten up the rim so that we can do the last little part. And this is what's going to make the jar the jar. Any tool will work. The tool is going to define the shape of this inner edge. I would use something round. I'm going to use the corner of this little guy right here. And at a slow speed, we split that clay in half. And all that's doing is creating that little edge for the things to sit on, for the rim to sit on. And the cleaner you can get that part, the better. Get rid of the little extra chunks. Don't want to be there. And then just like we kind of talked about before, with anything that we want to be food safe or handleable, we do want to make sure that our edges are rounded up. We don't want sharp corners because the glazes prefer rounded over edges. And we want there to be enough of a shoulder for the lid to sit on without falling off. So just like we did right here, it's not going to separate too badly. All right, okay, so important things. Again, clean it up as much as you can so you don't have to mess with it too much later. I'm just getting rid of that extra chunk. And then we want to take our lid master, our width gauge, and we want to go just about to the edge at the widest point. And then again, that's going to tell me that's the same width as that guy right there, and that's going to tell me exactly how wide we want the lid to be. So this guy gets set off to the side, and there's a lot of different ways that you could think about doing these lids. If you wanted to roll a slab by hand, right, and then cut it out to that circle shape, and then add a knob to it just like they did on the jars, you can do that. It doesn't have to be wheel thrown. You can build the entirety of the lid by hand. You know what I'm saying? So if you wanted to sculpt it and do something kind of interesting with it, you totally could do that. You could pinch pot a bowl to make the thing sit. It just needs to be something to close it up. But if you prefer to try it on the wheel, which I highly recommend doing, because that little added component is going to make the project, you know, more wheel unique, I guess, do it. Now for the jar, you go with the smaller chunk of clay. And this is a little bit more complex because we have to pull up extra clay in the middle. So, again, with that said, if you have a flat thing that fits inside of there perfect, if you build, I'm thinking of the inside of your mini pot, like a bear, like a little tiny gummy bear sized thing, and you score and slip it to the top, that will 100% work. You could take literally any chunk of clay and score and slip it to this thing. I'll show you that in a second. Hold on. All right, so we center, pull the clay up, and I'll show you what I mean with that in a second. All right, so now officially this thing would sit inside on that rim, right? If I wanted to do this by hand and create a circle just by cutting it out using any shape, because all it has to be is the flat thing that sits on it, right? I could take any tiny sculpture, I could take any chunk of clay I wanted to. If I wanted this to be my knob, if I score and slip it to the top, I officially have a little knob. So you guys get where I'm going with that, right? It's just a flat thing that sits on top of it. Okay, so let's build the lid for this thing. We'll go a little bit wider with it. Compress that down. You don't typically want these things to be too thick, but now at this point, I'm going to, instead of adding a knob after the fact, I'm just taking some of this clay that's on the surface and I'm pushing it towards the middle. And for this one, I'm going to give it a little shape, and I don't like the way that looks, so I'm changing it. And so that's basically it, right? So that's my knob. That's gonna sit on there. Let's check the width. And for those watching on camera, it's a little bit wide. I'm even gonna get rid of some of this. And then the next most important stuff that has to happen in the next day. Basically, we want to get this thing off as soon as possible, make sure that it fits. But the cool thing about this is if you get this part exactly as is and it's perfect, then you almost don't have to do any trimming to it. Like, you don't have to clean it up whatsoever. It literally sits on top of the inside. You can wipe it down with a sponge. You can sculpt at it as much as you like, but it's pretty much done at this point. Double check, and then bam. Still hair wide, but I'll kind of cut that off. So we slice with the wire, and then that guy's gonna sit on there the next day. So this thing, again, fits in there just like that. Pretty much perfectly. Cool. Give it a shot. Give it a shot. Turn that off for me, Jay.